Atheist Alliance International Podcast with Andy Phillips.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome everybody to the newest podcast of Atheist Alliance International with your host Andy Phillips and myself, Diogenes of Mayberry, also known as Jason. Today we have Dr. Jesse Bering, who's a psychologist at Otago University and the author of one of my favorite books, The Belief Instinct, and the subtitle, The Psychology of Souls, Destiny, and the Meaning of Life. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And thank you, Jesse, for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Okay, it's just, Jesse, maybe just tell us a little bit about your work and what you're doing.
Oh, it's a long, complicated, probably boring story, but a strange one. I guess I'm what they call a cognitive scientist of religion. So my work focuses primarily on the cognitive biases or psychological mechanisms by which we think about God, meaning, purpose, the afterlife, signs, destiny, these types of big fundamental, I guess what I would consider existential questions. And gosh, I've been doing this for a long time. My earliest work in this area was back as a PhD student. My dissertation was with young children's beliefs about what happens to the mind after death. So that's kind of how I got my start. I did a little puppet show where it was sort of a harmless, innocuous display of a mouse puppet getting eaten by an alligator. This was in Florida when I was doing this work, hence the alligator. And we told these kids that the mouse was dead, and then we asked them questions about whether the mouse could still do various things or have certain capacities now that he was dead. So could he still smell the grass where he was walking right before he got eaten? Was he still lost? Because in the story we were telling them in the puppet show, he was lost and sort of wandering around. Anyway, to make a long story short, what we found was quite counterintuitive, which was that the younger the child, the more likely they were to say that the dead mouse's mind survived its death. And that's counterintuitive because the common assumption, at least at that time, and probably still today, is that children are somehow indoctrinated into these afterlife beliefs. They are taught that the soul departs the body after death. Those are my dogs wrestling in the back.
I'm worried.
Is it like super annoying?
I thought it was a television.
Yeah, the problem is that this is like literally a one-bedroom cottage, and I can't even put them anywhere else.
Yeah. So just for our viewers who are watching, he's out in the middle of nowhere at a cottage. So he's using a pocket Wi-Fi, so he might be a little bit spotty. The audio visual sync might be out a little bit at times, but just please bear with us for that. So now I've referred to you in some of my writing as an evolutionary psychologist. Would that be a fair descriptive, or would you prefer cognitive?
I'm evolutionarily minded, I think, in terms of my approach and my theoretical framing and my research questions. But I'm not a sort of standard textbook evolutionary psychologist studying mating and reproduction and the sort of classical questions in evolutionary psychology.
No, the sort of key thing for me, the way my mind sort of thinks, and I'm not an academic, but do you think that the concept of God, for instance, and those sort of things, all the things that we sort of take for granted, the vast population of this planet sort of takes for granted that God exists. Do you think that is something which is constructed by us?
Not in a straightforward way. I can't answer that question in terms of yes or no. I think it's a complicated question. I wouldn't say that it's a deliberate sort of intentional construction to see some sort of intelligent agency or mind that is communicating with us or giving us messages. My argument is more that this is the default sort of stance that human psychology takes, that we basically have evolved a certain cognitive lens by which we perceive things and see reality, and that the way that this sort of cognitive system is structured, it railroads us into belief. So in other words, we are strongly pushed in the direction of belief just because of the way that our minds construct what we see as meaningful messages and those types of things in terms of like interpreting significant events in our lives and so on. So I think I've never liked this sort of argument that that people have somehow decided to create a deity or God, or the belief that we'll be reunited with loved ones, because I think that is more it's much more nuanced and layered than that.
Do you think this, because I get exactly where you're coming from, because I sort of have the same feeling that it's not something which we've made up. It's it's something which seems to be sort of hardwired into us in some ways, that we look at these things, we experience things in the world. And because I saw one of the experiments you did with some children, where you told them to stand behind a line and throw a ball behind them to try and hit a target, and don't look. You told them don't look.
It's impossible
in a room. And basically they all cheated. They all cheated because they were in a room on their own. No one's looking at them. And so they can basically just cheat. And that's what kids tend to do. But then you told them there was an invisible princess sitting in a chair watching them, and then left them alone again. And their actions showed that they believed that, even though they said they didn't believe it. They felt the chair, she was invisible and all that sort of thing. But just the psychological process of telling them that someone was sitting there watching them changed their behavior.
Yes.
And so that is astonishing, because it's in us to believe in something even if they can't see it.
Can I? I've got a quote here from you, Jesse. I know. So the belief instinct is 10 years old now. Jesse was saying earlier that he doesn't necessarily remember, but I have one of his quotes here that goes to this. It says, in other words, the illusion of a punitive God assisted their genetic well-being whenever they underestimated the risk of actual social detection by other people. This fact alone, this emotional short-circuiting of ancient drives in which immediate interests were traded for long-term genetic gains, which have rendered God and his ilk a strong target of natural selection in human evolution. So I think that says a lot about how, we're going back to my question about being an evolutionary psychologist, that these are traits that they're basically a byproduct of evolution, that they take hold.
Right. So when I wrote the book, I do have a chapter sort of about the evolutionary mechanisms, or what I see as the adaptive problem that God solved, or sort of the illusion of some sort of intentional agency that's monitoring our social behavior. And that problem is something that is, in my view, fundamentally unique to human social behavior. It's a problem that is not shared by any other species ever to have existed, including our closest living relatives, which are chimpanzees. And that is the fact that what we do in the presence of somebody else doesn't stay sort of circumscribed to that particular social environment. It will spill out and have reverberations, because that person can communicate our transgression or whatever it is that we did in their presence, even if they're a low status individual. As long as they can talk, basically, they can gossip. And gossip is the problem that I'm referring to. This potential for absent third-party punishment coming from people who acquired information about our behavior even in their absence. And we therefore had to be incredibly vigilant about what we did when others were potentially able to see us or learn about our behaviors. And of course, what's a transgression or not is going to differ from society to society, but there will be repercussions in the sense of our reputations, and reputation is everything when it comes to genetic fitness with human behavior. So what I to sort of extrapolate that from that sort of line of reasoning from the study that you described, Andy, with the kids in the room left alone with this, we call her Princess Alice, this invisible woman who was sitting in a chair watching them. The supposition there is that if there's a slight chance that they can be detected by somebody else who finds out about what they did, they might as well be hypersensitive to that possibility. And telling somebody that there's an invisible watcher in the room is one way to do that. So it's better safe than sorry.
Is this that experiment, when you actually put it out to the wider population and through time, humanity through time, do you think that's exactly what's happening with the concepts of things like God and spirits? And because we obviously different people in the world have different perceptions of what that is, but it all seems to be a similar sort of process, that there's something watching you. Is that where that was going, where that experiment was going, to sort of see if that can be extrapolated to human population?
Yeah, we haven't done, this is something that I would like to do, some sort of cross-cultural comparison with an experimental design like that. We did do that study, or a modified version of that study, with adults when I was still at the University of Arkansas. It was a laboratory experiment, and rather than throwing a ball on a dartboard like the kids did, we gave them a similarly sort of impossible task that was designed for adults, which was a spatial intelligence task. And they had to solve very complex problems on a computer screen. And we told them in advance that there was a glitch in the programming. So occasionally when they saw a question pop up, the answer would be displayed. And if that happened, to please press the space bar as quickly as possible. So we got basically a measure of the latency of response, how long it took them to press that space bar to answer the question honestly without studying the answer and cheating, basically. And the rub was that, so that was the control condition, but in the experimental condition, we had told participants that the graduate student who had designed the study had unfortunately recently died, and his ghost had been seen in that laboratory recently. This was sort of mentioned casually in passing by the experimenter when they introduced the study to the participants. So half the group was basically told that there was a ghost in the room, the ghost of the dead graduate student that designed this spatial intelligence task, and the other was just told about the glitch itself. And just like the kids, the people that thought or heard that there was a ghost in the room were less likely to cheat, significantly less likely to cheat. So in other words, in this case, they pressed the space bar significantly faster than did those who were in the control condition. What we didn't do with that study, unfortunately, was ask whether, and I don't know why I didn't do this, this was quite a while ago, but we didn't ask the participants if they believed in the afterlife or not. So that would have been something to look at. But you asked about sort of whether this was a ubiquitous phenomenon, the sort of sense of being watched and how that influences or changes people's behaviors. And I think that's, although we don't have good laboratory or experimental evidence to that effect, I think the anthropological literature is rife with anecdotes and stories of people's sensitivity to supernatural watchers and how that affects their behaviors and their presence.
Because it's sort of just sort of a lot of this sort of evidence, the sort of stuff that you've done, and some of the other things that have happened, scientific evidence toward this concept that we construct gods, not purposely, but just it's a sort of a symptom of our mind, the way our minds work. Because there was something many years ago where a scientist, I think it was Dr. Straussman or something like that, I can't remember the name very well, but did an experiment with hallucinogenic drugs. He used DMT on, I think it was like 90 different subjects, and they were people who, some believed in God, some people didn't believe in God, but he was looking at the therapeutic consequences of hallucinogenic drugs in people and seeing what therapy could be used with them. But the sort of byproduct of that was that with DMT, which is something which I think the Amazonian tribes use to contact the spirit world and things like that, it showed that the people had very, very powerful mystic experiences, and in fact could connect with the spirit world through that drug. And so do you think all these sort of things are constructed within our minds? Our minds are incredibly amazing pieces of machinery. They're not something which we understand very well. So do you think that these sort of things, the experiments you do, the experiments that Dr. Straussman did back in the 90s, and other experiments like that, sort of show that our mind is the thing that is powering this belief in God? Because if you think about this, there's billions of people who believe in God, and for no really good reasons, no really evidential reasons. So is there something which is just built into us?
I believe so. I think it has to do with our social cognition. What I talk about in the belief instinct, this theory of mind, that we cannot help but perceive agency, intentions, mental states in places where it doesn't exist. Basically, we're highly social animals, and we are exquisitely attuned to detecting other people, especially other human beings, mental states to explain and predict their behavior. But it kind of spills over into ontological categories where it doesn't properly belong. So we do this all the time, of course, with inanimate objects. We tend to see them as being purposeful, intentional agents as well. But even things much more abstract, like thinking about purpose. Purpose is something that is fundamental to human beings everywhere, I would say. This sort of sense of why are we here, this question about why we are here. If you even ask that question, what is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? All these questions, that assumes that there was some sort of intelligent agency that created us with some purpose in mind. So there was this sort of superior artisan that designed us with some sort of teleological or teleofunctional purpose. So if you listen to kids, little kids, they ask why. They don't ask how. It's all about trying to understand other minds and the reasons that intelligent agents do the things that they do. So I think that's the starting point, that, this is just simply because we are the animal kingdom's sort of natural psychologist, as Nicholas Humphrey says, which I quite like that term. We perceive the universe in those terms. We see minds everywhere. And so I think that it is a construction of the human mind, but it also is it is just sort of the default scaffolding by which we operate. And atheists or skeptics or rationalists are unusual, I guess, in the sense that they don't trust their own psychological intuitions. it's cognitively effortful to question those attributions, whereas most individuals will just simply it's much easier to feel than to think. You just sort of assume that your intuitions have some veracity in terms of what they're mapping onto. But as a cognitive scientist, I know that's not the case, that it has no necessary bearing on the reality outside of our heads.
It's interesting you say, because as an atheist, I mean, I've never believed in God. Even as a child, I never believed in God, and it wasn't intuitive to me at all. And I looked around at the world around me, and I saw, my parents and my friends and the grown-ups all around me believing in God, and it didn't really register with me. You talk about things like purpose. I've always believed that we don't have one. It's not. And maybe I'm just weird. Maybe I'm just weird. Maybe I'm just different from most people. But I never really had this instinctive thought that I may be here for a purpose, or humanity is here to fulfill some sort of purpose. When I started reading things like astronomy books and things like that, and noticing that we're on a desolate little planet, in the middle of nowhere on the edge of a spiral galaxy, nowhere special, nowhere special. It always seemed to me that we just don't have a purpose. There's no purpose. We have purpose in life and things like that, but there is no sort of God-given purpose. But am I unusual in that, do you think?
Probably, but I would also need to experimentally interrogate, I guess, your reasoning when it comes to these types of questions, because I don't have those. I don't believe in God either. I've never believed in God, even as a child, and I find those questions, although emotionally evocative and intuitive to me at a very sort of basic level. I've never subscribed to them. I've never felt like they have any sort of philosophical validity in and of themselves. But they're not foreign sentiments to me, if you know what I mean. So we did one study, for instance, where we sort of framed the study as though it was a study about autobiographical memory. So participants didn't think we were necessarily asking about their belief in God or anything like that. But we interviewed them about, basically, we had them tell us what are these sort of the most significant events in your life. If you were to sort of reflect on the main turning points or sort of critical episodes of your life story. And then we systematically asked them questions about, I don't remember exactly how the wording was, but it was basically, why do you think this happened to you? And the answers that we got, even among the atheists, the hardcore sort of Dawkinsian, strident non-believers, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes betrayed this sort of teleofunctional reasoning, so that they were saying, I'll just give you an example. I remember one young woman was saying that she failed one of her courses, and it was something very important to her. She lost a scholarship. She had a completely changed direction in terms of her studies. But she said, but thinking back, I know now that was meant to happen, because that changed me into a different career path, and I'm much happier now. Another non-believer said this about why he feels like he got rejected for a job that he desperately wanted, because he ultimately ended up in another job, and he met his wife, and he realizes now that was kind of meant to happen as well. So although they weren't using the language of theology or God or anything like that, they were still at a very primal sort of level invoking a mind behind the scenes that was doing things for a reason, steering them this way and that. They would adamantly reject it, put in those terms. Yeah. But and they didn't do this across the board. So sometimes they would say, well, I know it didn't happen for any particular reason, but they would sort of find themselves in that intersection, that sort of tension between feeling it in one way emotionally, but intellectually they rejected that intuition. So I don't know where you would fall with that. And there definitely were people that across the board just said, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. There's no particular deeper meaning behind these things happening to me. But I guess as a result of that study and others, I've always been a little bit suspicious, I guess, of just casual rejections of all theistic sentiments.
Because it's those big questions, and it's like, where did we come from? What's our purpose in life? What happens when we die? You talk about the afterlife and things like that, and for me, I've always had those just big block answers. Where do we come from? We don't know. How did life start? We don't know yet. I'm quite happy with the I don't know answer. I don't really need to have some sort of answer for that. What's our purpose in life? We don't particularly have one. We make our purpose. But and what happens when we die? We go to the earth and that's it. We're gone. We have a finite lifespan like every other animal on the planet. Am I too logical? Am I missing something in life? Because it's always been like that for me, and this is why I find it fascinating why literally billions of people around the planet have to have a supernatural answer to this where none is exhibited, and I don't really quite get that. And that's what fascinates me about what I do and what I write about, because it doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't quite understand it, even as opposed to I do understand it in as far as it's something that our mind does. So what about afterlife? What does that mean?
Well, I'll give you sort of another example using the afterlife as a case where we oftentimes find ourselves thinking or reasoning in terms that betray our implicit thoughts about the subject of the continuity of our consciousness after death. So I first started thinking about this when my mother died, because and this was when I was doing my PhD, and this kind of motivated a lot of my research in this area, actually. But I even at that point, I firmly rejected the idea of any sort of afterlife. She was Jewish. I think that she didn't have very clear notions of what Jews were supposed to believe about the afterlife to begin with. I would see her as she was more of an agnostic. I was definitely atheistically inclined at that point. And I wanted to believe. I think that probably would have given her solace at that point, and me as well. But I couldn't muster up the illusion of conviction, I suppose. But I did find myself doing something curious, which was feeling the need to put items in her casket, like family photos, that brought comfort to me for some strange reason. And when I began to sort of try to make sense of that, it wasn't a very rational act, because thinking in some way that she can actually appreciate or see the family photos that I'm putting in the casket with her. But yet I felt the need to do that. And other things too. I would experience things around the house, like in that Through the Wormhole documentary that maybe you watched, Jason or Andy. I give the example of the wind chimes blowing outside the window the night after she died, and my immediate thought was, oh, that's Mom. She's telling me that she's okay. I didn't believe that, but I thought that, and I had to sort of rationalize myself away from that. But there was no question that popped into my mind, that thought. And I think most people would just kind of go with it and not sort of question their own intuitions. They would be sort of they would happily subscribe to the feeling, because it's a nice feeling, it's a pleasant feeling to think that there is a continuing relationship after death. But none of those things bore any relationship to my explicit belief. So I never believed in the afterlife. I still don't believe in the afterlife, but these feelings were not foreign to me. And I guess that's sort of what I wanted to capture in the psychology experiments that I do. These sort of glimpses of low-level cognitive processes that reveal the sort of very basic substructure of religion and cognition. I'm not.
I get that completely. I mean, I do understand that completely, because I'm exactly the same. When my mother died, I felt a deep connection to that process, and I am not a heartless bastard. I'm not. And when my mother died, it was there was this sort of mental transitional journey that I took, where when she died, I wanted her to be at peace, and I wanted her to be happy wherever she was.
Mhm.
And that goes against everything, absolutely everything that I believe in. From a cognitive viewpoint of reality, my reality. But I subscribe to that as well. I mean, I believe that we, human beings are symbiotic with this planet, and as we've evolved through time, we have grown to connect with the planet in some way. And so I understand that there's these mental processes that we go through, because I went through exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
But
I often say, I've said quite a few times that the thoughts of the afterlife comfort the living; they do nothing for the dead. So
yeah, and I think that's the whole point of this process. It's the whole point of it's how we cope with things. It's as I say, when my mother died, she was a believer, and one thing that really sort of hit me right in the eyes was on her deathbed, literally on her deathbed, she held my hand and said, "I'll see you soon." Now, I knew in my heart of hearts that that's never going to happen, because I don't believe in an afterlife. But I squeezed her hand and said, "Yes, of course."
Yeah, we become pragmatic.
Yeah, because it's like, it's no skin off my nose. I'm not going to give my mother a lecture about about things on the deathbed, but and it made her feel better, and in reality, it made me feel better as well.
Yeah.
It made me feel better. Whether standing back from it, I actually believe those things is sort of irrelevant at the time. And I think this is the thing that I think a lot of people think, that atheists are heartless, or they don't see that side of it. They don't see that human connectivity, but we do. We all do. It's a natural thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're really, and I think that the point of believing, if we could, because it does feel good, is a significant one, because it's not, to me, it's not as though belief is a conscious choice or an option that we could just simply decide one day, okay, I'll believe now. It just doesn't quite work that way. We've got too much information, I think, that is contending with our intuitions to allow us to sort of just to go with that. But there is a lot of correlational evidence suggesting that belief in life after death actually is good for subjective well-being, or is it's meaningfully correlated, at least.
And part of the evolutionary process,
in terms of reducing anxiety and those types of things, that's one argument, perhaps. I think there's some logic to that, but I've never been terribly convinced by terror management theory perspectives that somehow convincing ourselves in a literal immortality will reduce our fears of death in this life. But
how much do you think the people's fear of death plays into their belief in an afterlife? They can't get their head around the fact that their theory of mind doesn't exist beyond their death, that they need to project it into the afterlife. Do you think fear is a motivator there?
I think it's a motivator, but most of the research actually suggests that there's no strong relationship between degree of fear of death and belief in life after death. There have been correlational studies trying to link the two, but it's not as predictive as you would think it would be. So there are people that are quite low in existential anxiety that nevertheless have very strong beliefs in life after death, and vice versa. But you do see these interesting effects where you, in terror management theory literature, where you sort of get people to think consciously, vividly about being dead or lying in a coffin or something like that. It does have measurable effects on their social behaviors and sort of interesting results in that way. So it does something in terms of our thinking about death does do something in terms of our social reasoning and our behaviors.
Is this the do you think there's like a predisposition for a want to have some sort of continuity of consciousness? So the consciousness does exist after we die, something about us, our soul, whatever it is, that we can't just stop. Is that something which people...
I think so. There's in the one side, there's a sort of theoretical position that belief in life after death is somehow motivated by a desire or a wish that we will somehow, our consciousness will somehow outlive our brains, because it's inherently frightening to think of oblivion and nothing and those types of fear-based arguments, I guess, for life after death. My view with this has been much more about our inability really to think properly about the absence of consciousness. So it's literally impossible to mentally represent a state of non-being, because we have nothing to sort of draw from as an analogy. So you can say theoretically it's like being under general anesthesia, or it's like being, whatever it was in that time frame before you were born, but we never consciously experienced that absence of consciousness. So we can't really use that very effectively in terms of thinking about, okay, it's going to be like that after death, because there's no like sort of comparison that we can make. So it's a simulation constraint, I guess, in my mind, that we cannot simulate the absence of consciousness properly. And when we try to imagine what it's like to be dead, or think about what somebody else is experiencing now that they are dead, we can't help but put ourselves into their shoes, and that leads us into these sort of errors of sort of attributing mental states to them. So there's less of a sort of an emotional component, I guess, with that type of reasoning. But I think they're probably complementary. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I think that there's a really strong cognitive factor that's not often considered with these types of questions. And to me, a lot of it has to do with just simply our inability to think properly about mortality, because our brains are not designed to do that. It's a glitch. It just simply leads us to the illusion of continuity. I mean, if you think about it, it's just absolutely, it's shocking to me that it doesn't surprise people that it's weird to assume that, for instance, you can see something as basic as just seeing heaven or seeing what's after death, when your visual cortex is, it's sitting and moldering under the ground, or it's been obliterated through cremation. I don't think most people would question the idea that if your brain wasn't working properly while you were alive, you couldn't possibly see. That if you damage your visual cortex and or have some sort of catastrophic brain injury, that's not going to affect your subjective experience while you're alive. So if you completely destroy the brain, how can it possibly work? It's just bewildering to me that people don't see this sort of weird contradiction there between their acknowledgement of neuroscience and the basic principles of neuroscience when it comes to this sort of subjective experiences and the brain, but not the complete destruction of the brain.
But isn't this because there's a sort of promoted belief, especially by religions, but also from people who are maybe not religious but spiritual, let's say, that there is there's a distinction between our human form and our consciousness. So consciousness isn't attached to the brain in their view.
Yeah.
Whereas I think most, scientific processes would say that consciousness is a factor of the brain. It's like, if your brain doesn't exist, then a consciousness doesn't exist, because we can only be conscious during our life. So if we die, there is no consciousness, and that's a sort of scientific view. Whereas I think
that's the traditional
religion doesn't feel that way. Consciousness is separate; it's the soul, isn't it? So it's promoted as that.
Yeah. And I think that it's this enormous confluence of driving factors that leads to belief in life after death. So not only do you have these sort of cognitive imperatives and this very, this hurdle of thinking about nothing after death, sort of representation of nothing after death. It's not even nothingness, because to say that there's nothingness after death is to endow it with some perceptible attribute of blackness or sort of nothingness, or something that you could actually discern in terms of a void or an absence. In fact, it's not even that. And so but our brains can't help but sort of fill in the blanks by endowing it with some perceptible attributes. So not only do we have the cognitive factors that promote belief in the continuity of consciousness after death, but yes, we've got organized theologies, we've got just common sort of popular sentiment, we've got cultural factors, we've got evolutionary mechanisms in terms of like the argument that somehow, fear of the punishment after death will actually influence our behaviors in this life. So all of these things lean very heavily toward the person thinking that they will survive their own death. That doesn't make it true, but the chances are, and 8 out of 10 people statistically do believe or are convinced that they will survive death. Probably more, but that's what the survey data indicate.
Because there's a big sort of difference between the concept of life after death, your consciousness carrying on, and the stories that religion place upon that. Things like heaven and hell and paradise and all those sort of things. These are the destinations. These are the sort of made up destinations that every religion sort of has this concept of. If we carry on, then you'll go here. And because of those sort of narratives, where you grow up as a Catholic or a Jew or, Sikh or whatever it is, that you have this vision stamped upon you of when you die, this is what happens. So it almost seems like there is a predisposition to believe that there's got to be some sort of continuous flow of your consciousness, whereas we know there probably isn't, in the cold light of day, the cold scientific light of day. But because you've got these stories as well bolted on to the concept of afterlife, then obviously the consciousness must carry on. Otherwise, how would you get there? And I think that it's that bridge thing, Yeah,
you're right. I mean, the predisposition is what is universal in terms of flushing out all these incredibly wild narratives across the world in terms of what exactly happens or where you go or the journey that you take in the afterlife. But there is this sort of basic assumption that somehow we continue. That is universal. The stories differ, but the ingredients are the same. The mind survives somehow. And of course, there are, we're speaking in terms of just the sort of scientific language, as critics would call this, or people who believe that there are these sort of metaphysical loopholes, I guess, that they would say that, well, actually, you don't need a brain to be conscious. What do you need a brain for to begin with? Because consciousness is just that the brain is basically just a radio receiver, and then just because the radio is broken doesn't mean that the signal disappears. That sort of, which just to me begs more questions.
It's woo-woo. It's woo-woo.
Yeah. So I'm still trying to get my head around exactly what those types of arguments mean. I don't think most people who endorse them really understand them either. But there is an intuitive appeal, I think, to that position, that somehow, what do you need a brain for anyway? That sort of, the brain basically becomes this prosthetic device that is wholly unnecessary.
There's an interesting correlation there. So Jesse mentioned earlier, he was on an episode of Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. It was season 3, episode 10, Did We Invent God? And in that episode, they also introduced, they had Jesse on, but they also had Dr. Andrew, was it Newberg? And Dr. Andrew Newberg on, who pioneered the principles of neurotheology. And one of the experiments they did was they were putting different types of believers into a functional MRI and asking them to contemplate God. So they were putting Christians in, and when Christians pray to God, they're literally having a conversation with God. So their verbal cortex is lighting up, but then they would put a Buddhist in, and Buddhists have like this abstract, so their visual cortex is lighting up. So just even the way different cultures perceive God is it's manifesting itself differently in the way their brain function is working. Mm-hmm. And then the interesting thing was they put the atheist in and said, think about God, and there was no change.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you think that there's the atheists, like myself and many others around the world, that do you think that there is something within us that actually believes there is something, even though we don't think there is something? So on a sort of
genetic level,
basic level, we really don't believe that sort of stuff, and it's just in us not to believe it. I honestly don't believe it. But is there something within us that is sticking in the back of our minds, that when we get near a death, for instance, that we sort of start reaching out, the neurons start firing, we start reaching out into our own consciousness to hope that there's going to be something out there? I mean, is there any sort of research into how, these weird people like us see afterlife, nearer death, or something like that?
Not nearer death. There are. I mean, I guess I would say that belief is less interesting to me. The sort of epistemic position is less interesting to me than how you actually reason and think at an implicit level, because I think that belief oftentimes is noise, and individuals aren't even aware necessarily of how they're processing information, or sort of envisioning their own lives and their sort of folk beliefs would be one way to describe it, because it's so quickly overridden by our atheism. We might not even sort of recognize it happening. There's a story that I talk about in The Belief Instinct with Jean-Paul Sartre, who's nearing death. He's in his 80s and he's failing in his health, and he's talking to Simone de Beauvoir, and he's giving her this sort of really frank, candid description of his psychological processes at that time. And he's saying, it's strange, after everything that I've written about the illusion of God and existence precedes essence, and all those types of famous lines that he authored. He says that I still can't help but feel like I was born to do this, or I was made to have the life that I had, that my existence was somehow predetermined, and I was here for a reason. And so he's kind of recognizing this tension between what I've been talking about, and I think what you're getting to too, which is this sort of niggling little voice that we have in the back of our minds that means that we're just like everybody else in terms of how we think about these things. It's just that we muzzle it, whereas other people don't muzzle it. They just sort of allow it free expression and free reign, and they endorse their intuitions and those feelings wholeheartedly without interrogating them in the way that we do, and realizing that it's actually rational and illogical, that level of thought. So
but see, this is my point, Jesse. I don't feel like I'm muzzling it. I don't feel like I don't feel like I'm an atheist on purpose.
Mhm.
I don't think I've sort of sat down one day and said, well, let me just think about this and look at this logically and decide what I'm going to be. It never happened to me. I just never believed. I never, I'm a big reader of scientific literature, journals, white papers. I love all those sort of things. They are incredibly interesting. And I suppose that reinforces my following of science and reason, rather than that psychological flow of consciousness into the universe and all those sort of things. Deepak Chopra rubbish that I sort of annoys me. So do you think I'm muzzling it, unconsciously muzzling it, or is am I just like that?
I think you're probably like me, really. I think we're probably similar, sort of in our approach to these questions. And when I say muzzle, I don't mean that it's sort of a tactical, sort of strategic type of manipulation that you're trying to shut down those thoughts.
I will not believe.
But the fact that you can even appreciate the psychological processes and mechanisms that we're referring to me suggests that you do have that understanding, a shared understanding of the human experience, of what these phenomena basically involve. And if they were that foreign to you, you just couldn't even grasp the nature of these things. It just wouldn't make any sense to you at all. And in fact, we do find that with some that study that I told you about earlier, with people talking about their the most traumatic event that ever happened to them and the sort of autobiographical experiences and turning points in their lives. When we interviewed high-functioning autistics or people with Asperger's syndrome, they literally did not understand what we were asking them when we asked them, why do you think this happened? They would just give us a very sort of physicalist explanation or answer to that question. Well, I didn't get the job because I said this, and then he thought, and then he did this, and then I left the room, and they had a conversation, and they decided not to hire me. But it wasn't about sort of their life story or sort of the purpose of this in any sort of meaningful way, which kind of maps onto many people with Asperger's experiences in their social interactions with other people. Anyway, I'm not saying you have Asperger's syndrome or that I have Asperger's syndrome or anything like that. But there are individual differences, and people are on the spectrum. And I think the fact that we're having a common understanding of the problems that we're referencing suggests to me that psychologically you get it. Believing is different. That's a much more sort of sophisticated epistemology than, I guess, the level of thinking that I'm interested in. I'll give you another example. I just completed a study here in New Zealand where we basically asked the question of whether people who say they don't believe in the afterlife, obviously they don't believe in ghosts, therefore, if they are put in a situation where they are told that there's a ghost, they should not behave in a fashion, or their bodily responses, their physiology should not respond in a way that is suggestive that they have been influenced or affected by that information of a ghost being present in the room. So we did this. We hooked people up to these physiological measurement devices in terms of skin conductance and heart rate, breathing, and told half of them that recently somebody had died in this room. It was a janitor. He had a heart attack in the room. And casually, as an aside, we said that his ghost has been seen in this room. They thought they were doing a study on mindfulness. They were doing a meditation task. That was sort of the face value of the study. So they were going through the study. And in the middle of it, we made the lights go off. So they were in a pitch black room. And we were looking at their physiological response to that manipulation. So, of course, we had a control condition. People were doing exactly the same thing, but they heard nothing about a ghost in the room or somebody dying in the room. And what we found was that, as you would probably expect, the people who were told about the ghost in the room, their anxiety was through the roof when the lights went off. They corrected quickly afterward. It's almost like they sort of talked themselves out of it. But the interesting thing was that even people who had zero belief in the afterlife or said that they do not believe in ghosts or anything like that, because we had that built into another measure that we gave them 2 weeks beforehand. Even they had this spiked response in response to being told about the ghost in the room. Now, I think there are different ways to interpret that, but the most provocative way to interpret it to me is that at some level, we are all vulnerable or susceptible to these supernatural, what we would call nonsense or supernatural ideas about sort of the presence of a deceased entity being present in a discarnate form. And our beliefs, what we say we believe, is not necessarily the best measure or the best reflection of our hidden psychology.
So we kind of default to the agency argument. So, like about 10 years ago, my ex, who was kind of a lapsed Catholic, and I was annoyed something had happened, and I went, "Oh, God is dicking with me," and she went, "You don't believe in God?" And I'm like, "Well, that doesn't mean he isn't screwing with me."
Part of the trick.
Yeah. But isn't this the typical thing that we talk about a lot, which is the way the mind works is about filling in gaps. The mind is not an infallible computer. The way. In fact, we don't really know exactly how the mind works. This is one of the reasons why you do your studies, and scientists all over the world do their studies on, cognition and neurology and all those sort of things. Is to try and discover, because everybody's. We understand the brain, the actual muscle, the brain. We understand exactly what that is. And we've gone into a lot of work on how to manipulate. We can do surgery on the brain with pretty much good certainty that we're doing the right things. We can cut the right things out, or whatever. But the mind is an uncharted landscape. We're beginning to understand it a little bit more, but we don't understand it fully. We don't understand how it works fully. The mind is a very, very sort of, it's a strange thing. We think we're getting around it. Over all the years that we've been studying the mind and consciousness and things like that, we're getting there. We're beginning to understand it, but there are certain things that we really don't understand. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about today is about, filling in gaps. It's like when you walk into a dark room, our eyes or our receptors can't see what's there properly. So we'll fill in as much as we can with our brain. Our mind will fill in those gaps, and we'll suddenly get our eyes sort of getting used to the darkness, and it'll fill it in a little bit more and fill it in a little bit more. It's just one of the reasons why I think people see ghosts, is because our mind fills in that gap and just puts in something which you don't expect. And suddenly you're seeing something which is really, really unusual. And I think that, there's that same as UFOs and all those sort of things. It's all that sort of stuff. We don't really understand the mind very well. Mm-hmm. And this is why I find this all completely fascinating. This idea or the concept of a consciousness that carries on and things. We're just trying to make sense of it all. That's what it feels like to me.
The other side of that, unfortunately, is that is oftentimes taken as evidence of the existence of the afterlife, for instance, that that consciousness is so complex that we just can't possibly get a handle on it in terms of our limited three-dimensional understanding.
Been done by someone else.
So therefore, there must be something beyond the ken of human cognition that is out there beyond our understanding. Just that sheer complexity lends itself to many people's belief or conviction that there has to be something else.
Well, this is the arguments that you have on the sort of intellectual battlefield when you're talking, between atheists and theists, that they will point out, well, if you don't understand it, it must be this, this incredulity fallacy, This is why it's quite difficult when we talk to theists quite a lot. We do conversations with theists, and it is always a black and white argument. There is either God or there isn't God, and I think this is why I think it's so interesting, because I think we do construct God in our minds. This is really the whole point of a lot of this conversation. Is like we're doing this in here. Mm-hmm. We may not know it, but we're constructing gods and spirits and the afterlife and all those concepts are all coming from in here. And I think that's absolutely bloody fascinating that we do that as human beings. Is it right or wrong? It is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. But to be able to do that, to construct things that are outside of our ken, is incredible, don't you think? I mean, it just seems amazing to me.
That's absolutely, and that's why it's always puzzling to me, because I do have some colleagues that take this sort of approach that the design of the human mind in terms of thinking about God and the afterlife and whatever is actually an artifact of God's creation, that somehow God has activated our minds to be receptive to communicating with us in this fashion. Newberg, for instance, I think his neurotheology, that's at the heart of his argument that that God is basically activating our brains in a manner that makes us more receptive to communication and with that other realm. And
yeah, I got that sense from him that he was a theist trying to prove that the brain is how God was communicating with us, rather than being objective about it, approaching it scientifically. So,
right. So it's not exactly a parsimonious interpretation, but on the other hand, philosophically, it's something that is it's difficult to challenge. I mean, it's not something that I spend a lot of time attempting to challenge, but to me, it just seems like rabbit holes that are not worth venturing down.
Because it's again that sort of God of the gaps process, though, isn't it? It's I don't understand how it works, so God must have done it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's excuse me, but I think it's intellectually lazy to do that.
Yeah. But even when we understand how it works, there's this sort of superimposing of agency on top of that. So that's why you see, I mean, like Eben Alexander, his Proof of Heaven, this neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife and back, Harvard-trained neurosurgeon.
I remember that, yeah.
And so even though in many people, there's a sort of intricate understanding of neuroscience and the brain's functioning and even cognitive science and religious belief, but that doesn't persuade them that it is an illusion or that it's an artifact of human cognition. They think that it's just further evidence of exquisite creative design.
Yeah, the best critique I saw of Alexander came from a neurologist who was saying, this guy's, he's a surgeon, he cuts, he doesn't actually understand, like a neurologist does, how the brain actually functions. So,
well, the near-death, I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about the near-death experience work, but one of the things that jumped out at me rereading his book was that his descriptions of being in heaven and in the afterlife were suspiciously embodied, in the sense that when he described, for instance, flying on the back of a giant butterfly, he was in this sort of upright jockey position in the body of a human being, in this sort of our corporeal evolved human primate form, and describing a woman with an angel with crystal blue eyes and high cheekbones, and it was very sort of physical, bodily descriptions. And to me, this was interesting because when we think about people in the afterlife, or people who believe in the afterlife, it's oftentimes conceptualized as not bodiless or invisible souls per se, but more, well, yeah, invisible bodies. That the bodies are still there. It's just that we can't see them. So they're not discarnate, sort of in the sense that we tend to mean that in that sense, or in that term. They're embodied like we are. We just can't see them. And again, the reason is because that's the only way we can conceptualize it.
It's what we know. It's what we know.
Yeah.
Our imaginations hold no bounds, they say. Listen, guys, we've sort of gone well over time. It's been absolutely fascinating. And Jesse, we'd love to have you back to discuss more stuff like this, because it's, as I say, for me, it's personally just like I love all this stuff. So, listen, guys, thanks very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Hey guys, thank you.
Take care.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. I'm Andy Phillips, and don't forget we're risen apes, not fallen angels. See you next time.